Hayden Lake, Idaho, 100 miles from the Canadian border and almost 200 feet deep in the center of the lake. A 4,000-acre lake with 40 miles of beautiful shoreline. 118 billion gallons of precious water. We love Hayden Lake, and Hayden Lake is in trouble, deep trouble.
Is Hayden Lake really in deep trouble? Who has the facts? Not emotions, not politics. Facts. Scientists would be the safest bet. Trouble is, compared to most people, scientists are quiet types. They're thinkers, not talkers, unless someone asks them for their input. And even then, they're easily drowned out by folks who are more comfortable speaking out without benefit of the facts. So, let's ask some scientists about Hayden Lake in particular, and watersheds in general, and let's give them the microphone. But first, is Hayden Lake worth worrying about? I ask the question because some have said Hayden Lake isn't as important to the local economy, or as popular, or as infamously polluted as her big sister Lake Coeur d'Alene. And so, they say, we shouldn't be wasting our money and our efforts worrying about what is affectionately referred to as the duck pond. Because Hayden Lake used to be part of the Coeur d'Alene tribe's native lands, I asked tribal elder and historian Felix Arepa for information nobody else would have about the value of the lake to the tribe long before white people appeared on the scene.
There are different places around the lake where they have winter quarters. They'll choose a place, I don't know, somewhere around the lake where they can be protected against the north wind, and they can fish here year round. They call it Estumish. That's a cutthroat.
The trout fishery is still a highly valued, officially recognized, and protected benefit for which Hayden Lake is well known. The West Slope cutthroat trout, which is native to Hayden Lake and a significant contributor to the local economy, is also the official state fish of Idaho. Another of Hayden Lake's official and protected benefits is its value for recreation. Secondary recreation, as in activities on or beside the water that don't necessarily get you wet, and primary recreation, as in you are likely, either on purpose or inadvertently, to take water in your mouth, up your nose, and so forth. Hayden Lake is also where more than 1 million people and counting turn for clean, pure, healthy water. Lakeshore property owners who get their water directly from the lake, and the 1 million-plus folks whose water comes entirely from the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer. And, by the way, the aquifer is why the Coeur d'Alene tribe called Hayden Lake Hntaken.
Hntaken, that's the original in the name. Hntaken means it might be a place where you're taken in, you know. That's in relation to that whirlpool.
If you've heard those stories about the whirlpools, you should know that they're not just a fairy tale. And there's a perfectly logical explanation why whirlpools existed in Hayden Lake and may actually still appear unexpectedly from time to time. It has to do with how the lake formed in the first place.
There was an ice dam in the vicinity of Clark Fork that was about 2,000 feet high. And that failed suddenly, and the speculation is that it didn't fail from being overtopped. It actually failed from water seeping out underneath. So when it failed, it was as sudden a failure as you can possibly imagine. I believe, if I remember correctly, the estimates were that water over the present city of Spokane was flowing at about 200 feet deep. So it would have been an incredibly impressive thing to see from a high point.
Imagine boulders as big as cabins thundering over the landscape at about 80 miles an hour. When the water hit the prairie, it slowed down just enough for the heaviest boulders to tumble out, creating the floor of what is now Hayden Lake. The lighter stuff, the topsoil and so forth, kept going. As you can imagine, that rocky floor leaked, making whirlpools. the cracks gradually spackled in with silt, but as history and legend suggest, sometimes those seals broke loose.
And there were stories about this lake. They said there's always been a kind of a whirlpool that appears. Sometimes they'll throw something in there and it'll take it down. And here it says the whirlpool at the south end of the lake. The Indians threw a tippy poles which disappeared. Once an unwary Indian in a canoe was pulled down to the underground passage. He walked underground for 3 days until he saw a dim light that came toward a waterfall. Beyond the waterfall, he saw life and happiness. He plunged through the falls and was pulled underwater. When he bobbed to the surface, he saw the shore and trees. He swam until finally, lying exhausted on the shore, he found himself at Camila, and that's Post Falls. And that kind of tells the story about the aquifer.
So the Indians knew, without any doubt, long before white people did, about the strong connection between Hayden Lake and the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer, especially here, at the south end of the lake, near Honeysuckle Beach, where scientists now believe the bulk of the lake's leakage into the aquifer occurs, both through the bottom of the lake and through the porous ground across the dike. That leakage, which made itself known in legendary whirlpools, still happens today in a less dramatic way. And that leakage is critical for quenching the thirst of people in northern Idaho and eastern Washington, because, like any aquifer, what you take out, to drink or take a shower or water your yard, has to be replaced, recharged. The modern belief was that most of the aquifer's recharge came from Lake Pend Oreille, with Lake Coeur d'Alene and the Spokane River coming in second. With Hayden Lake's contribution, not even on the radar.
Our understanding of that has changed dramatically. Recharge from the lakes surrounding the aquifer. Hayden Lake has the highest estimated contribution on an average basis. So the contribution of Hayden Lake is Hayden Lake drainage is something that's very important as far as the aquifer is concerned.
So in addition to the emotional connection quite a few of us have with Hayden Lake, especially for those folks fortunate enough to own or have access to lakefront property, its value goes way beyond aesthetics and fun. Sounds like it's all good. So what was the talk about Hayden Lake being in deep trouble?
It takes a lot of pollution to take over a lake like ours, but that's what's happening to Hayden Lake.
Idaho Department of Environmental Quality says that Hayden Lake's water quality is threatened. It is threatened due to excess amounts of nutrients caused by human-related activities.
When I first was acquainted with Hayden Lake and began visiting here and working here in the early to mid-60s, this was an oligotrophic lake, which means it was very low in nutrients, very clear, very clean. Now it is mesotrophic, with many of the bays eutrophic, which means that it's a high amount of nutrients and high amount of algal growth.
State agencies, pushed by the federal government, have found that Hayden Lake's water quality is going downhill at a rate that's 29% above the acceptable level.
Oh yes, it's changed greatly. I think more because of the population around the backside of the lake.
Hayden Lake is formed in a bowl with steep, rugged mountains around it that are made up of very erosive soils. The geology is very fragile and easily transported when the vegetation is removed.
Hayden Lake is kind of unique. It's fragile in the sense that because it doesn't have water flowing through it, pollution that occurs within the drainage tends to be trapped.
The nutrients that are here from 30, 40 years ago are still being recycled in this lake.
I look at aerial photos photos. I have them from 1937, and I look at them today, and there's a big difference in the bays.
In the mid-60s, the lake came clear up to the bridge on the north end of the lake where the road crosses Hayden Creek. Now, the lake shore is several hundred feet further down into the lake. This is all filled up with sediment that has come out of Hayden Creek, and basically as a result of logging and road building and disruption of the natural hydrologic processes in Hayden Creek.
Huge amounts of weeds now are showing up in the bay due to increased phosphorus that's going into the lake from development that occurs around the lake.
Do you see the brown plumes of sediment pouring into the water during the spring thaw? Every year now, this runoff gets worse and worse. That's because the vegetation on the sides of the lake's bowl is constantly getting disturbed. And because Hayden Lake has no river outlet, the phosphorus carried in that runoff not only doesn't get carried out, it actually gets stronger over time, because pure water evaporates off in the summer, and then more polluted water pours in the following spring, and then more pure water evaporates off, and so on. What's responsible for the increase in runoff? Two of the biggest culprits are new development and logging, both on the shoreline and in the thousands of acres upslope in the watershed. A lot of development starts with logging, because logging comes with more lenient regulations about carving roads into the forest. These marginally engineered roads leave highly erosive soils raw and exposed, just waiting for even light rains to move those soils to the lake. And studies show that even when doing partial logging instead of clear cutting, and even when using so-called best management practices to prevent runoff, the runoff after partial logging is substantially higher than from an adjacent, identical lot left unlogged.
There is increased runoff and sediment produced from any logging. It doesn't matter if it's a clear cut or a partial cut. Logging produces increased water flows and sediment into the streams.
And because that runoff is rich in phosphorus, the nutrient that feeds algae and lakeweeds, here's what a popular fishing spot near Sportsman's Access looks like now.
I never really thought I would ever see this lake deteriorate this much.
Really?
Because it was such a cold, clear lake, you know, to start with. But you know, just like those people next door to the cabin, they can't control stormwater on that little lot with that big house. You know, and if you went to any other lake, they would never get a building permit. The county will give them one.
So it isn't entirely that developers aren't following the rules. In fact, many are. But the rules aren't stringently enforced, and even if they were, experts say those rules aren't protecting the environment enough. And there are also developers who dodge the rules, who are willing, for example, to measure the runoff on an environmentally sensitive piece of land during the dry time of year and neglect to mention what watchful citizens know all too well, that during the spring, the volume of water running off that land is perhaps 200 times higher than they've reported. With the county understaffed and under-budgeted, they're likely to get away with it, causing more and more sediment to contaminate the lake that belongs to everybody. And if they don't get away with it, well, it costs less to pay penalties than to do things right in the first place.
I can't get into the moral of it. My deal in life, my role, my responsibility is to be the voice of objectivity. So I have to be the voice of rationality. We look at it from a technical, scientific, from a cost benefit, from all those aspects, but moral is not within my job description.
And here's something a lot of people are afraid to bring up, because they know how some of you love your personal watercraft and your big, powerful motorboats. But studies show that the turbulence these machines cause, even when they're outside the no-wake zone, kicks up stuff that's already settled to the lake bottom. as far down as 30 or 40 feet.
This is one form of recycling we really would not want to do. We're starting a whole new problem for Hayden Lake.
And of course, the effects of that turbulence are seen most profoundly in areas where the water is shallower and where a lot of adults choose to, or youngsters are encouraged to, engage in fast or extreme motorsports.
We've lived on Hayden Lake since 1981, and we've always gotten our drinking water directly from Hayden Lake.
We used to change our water filter once a year. Now we have to change it every other month.
So tell me, how do you know when it's time to change the filter?
When it smells.
The water out of the faucet?
The water out of the faucet or the water out of the shower. You know it's time to change the filter.
The propeller action is stirring this up, and we believe that that phosphorus is getting kicked around like it never has in past years.
You look in the water and it's just pea green, and that's due to the number of algae plants that are there.
It's June, and I'm standing on the dock at Honeysuckle Beach. One of the first things I'm noticing is the color of the water. Look out across the surface, and it looks pretty normal. Look straight down. Ooh, it's rather shocking. As already mentioned, it's pea green. Literally pea green. Take a dip to cool off on this hot summer day, and you're likely to develop a case of swimmer's itch. Swimmer's itch is due to parasites that penetrate and live in your skin for about 5 to 7 days. They're carried by critters that live in the weeds that grow in the lake. So the more pollution, the more weeds, and the uglier and itchier your rash. Swimmer's itch is a sort of canary in the coal mine, letting you know that the lake's water quality is deteriorating. And there are other ramifications too.
Hayden Lake was historically a self-sustaining cutthroat trout fishery. With the deterioration of the watershed, the fishery can't support itself without large-scale trout stocking.
Cutthroat are a species of trout that needs clean, clear,